So welcome everyone. Very good to see you all. Thank you very much for spending time on a Thursday evening to come and join our talk tonight. I'm Paul Hannam. I'm co-chair of Greening Stenning as organising this particular event, which we're holding on the first Thursday of every month. A few housekeeping points I'd like to quickly go through. We're recording tonight, as I said, so if you don't want to appear at all, please turn off your video. Please stay on mute. And this is a really important one. We use chat for our questions, and I'm sure you will have questions for Dave. So can you please add them to the chat box? And this is the important thing, put a capital Q next to it so we know it's a question specifically for Dave. At all our other events, we have a lot of interaction with the audience. So we encourage you to add comments, add thoughts, books that you like or links, and it's part of this experience is getting people communicating with each other on chat, so that's great. So today is a special day in the world of literature. Who here knows that it's World Book Day? Anyone? You all seen that? A special day which we really celebrate the wonderful activity of reading, and our friends at Stenning Bookshop have agreed to give a 15% discount on Dave's books. So all you need to do is ring them up, contact them by email and just say Green Books, and then you'll get that discount applied. And we're welcoming Dave tonight, and in April, our next speaker, I'll mention a bit more at the end, will be Alice Ross from the Financial Times talking about green investing. So just briefly, I'd like to thank Joanne Knowles, who helped to set this up, and just tell you a little bit about Greening Stenning for those of you new to us. Whether you're a keen gardener, a nature lover, a bird watcher, or if you like David Attenborough's documentaries, many of us want to take real action to avert the disastrous climate and ecological breakdown that we're all facing. And Greening Stenning is really a community that's coming together. We have getting on to 1,000 people now on our list and over 100 volunteers, which for a small community is pretty amazing. And it's because we're really committed to doing something. And we are always welcoming new members. We're always welcoming volunteers. And we have 4 groups, which we'd love you to learn about. And what we really want to do is make Stenning one of the greenest, happiest and healthiest communities in the UK. We're going to be putting things in chat as we go through, so you can sign up to different green events. I just want to tell you about a couple before I hand over to Tony. On March 30th, we're having an evening talk about 20's Plenty, which about the plans to introduce a 20-mile-an-hour limit to Stenning, Bramber and Upper Beeding. So that's quite a big thing. We'll be talking about sustainable transport. And then on April the 27th, we've got a particularly special evening. It's going to be the biggest event we've ever had at Greening Stenning. And we've already got Isabella Tree from Manapa State speaking. We've got our local MP, Andrew Griffith, speaking. We've got a whole range of other speakers looking at our 9-year vision leading up to 2030, which is one of the most critical years we're facing, where we simply have to reduce carbon emissions by. So we'll be putting up more information. And what I'd like to do now is hand over to my good friend and co-conspirator in your better nature, Tony Whitbread.
Hello, everybody. Yeah, thanks very much. And it's good to see so many people here today. I think we're up to well over 180 now. It's great. So yeah, as Paul said, my name's Tony Whitbread. I'm the president of the Sussex Wildlife Trust. I worked for the Wildlife Trust for about 27 years. So thanks very much. It's good to be here. And I actually live in Storrington, just down the road from Stenning. So I also do quite a lot of work with the Greening Stenning as well. And it's a great pleasure to have Dave here today, which is fantastic. Professor Dave Goulson, professor at the Sussex University of Sussex, and also founder of the Bumblebee Conservation Trust, I think back in 2006. But I actually first met Dave just a few years ago now, because I give occasional talks, I think actually yearly talks, to the university students there to basically tell them about the Wildlife Trust, what it's like to work for a wildlife trust. And well, we have quite a few ex-university students, ex-Sussex University students actually working for the trust now. So some of them at least must be paying attention. So I met Dave back then. And at the time, he handed me one of his books, which was A Sting in the Tail, which I knew it was going to be good. But when I read it, it was absolutely brilliant. I was really transfixed by the detail, the information that you got. yes, it was all about bumblebees. I expected that. It was all about entomology, really. So you learned a great deal about bees, entomology, their behaviours, all that sort of thing. But also you learn a lot about landscape ecology, how systems work. You learn a lot about agricultural systems and how maybe agricultural systems aren't always favourable to bees, for example. So you learned all about that sort of stuff. So really interesting book. So it's great to actually pick up The Garden Jungle. Now, I'm not going to give any jokes about how my garden's always a jungle. Everybody knows that anyway. But it was great to get hold of that book. And I knew it was going to be good. There are actually many really good books on gardening for wildlife out already. Probably several of them on the shelf behind me. I enjoy reading them, and we all pick up a lot from these sorts of things. But this book, I would say, is so much more. There's really so much in there on transfixed. I'm actually reading through it now, look, bookmark and everything. So I'm actually paying a great deal of attention. So this is so much more. It's all about the intricate and dynamic systems that are working in your own garden. Things happening right under your noses that most of us don't know about. I was amazed by the ants, for example. I don't know whether we're going to hear about the ants today, but there's so much there, which is absolutely fascinating. So what's going on in your garden, the links to bigger picture items as well, but also how you can help with what's going on there. And I actually, the first page I liked because I thought this sets the tone. And on the every chapter has a recipe to start it off. And the first recipe there was how to make a mulberry muffin. And I thought that was great. So more or less, the first line said, well, first grow your mulberry tree. It'll take 10 years, but it'll be worth it. So I thought, yeah, this is the book for me. I kind of get this. And that set the tone for the whole book, I thought. So before I hand over, just to reiterate what Paul has already said, I'm going to be I've got another computer here, which is why I'm trying to pay attention here. I'm going to be trying to follow the questions that are coming in. There's quite a few of you, so I'll see if I can actually, grab the questions from the chat line and try to do a reasonable job at the end of this of trying to pass any questions over to Dave. And I think Dave will be speaking for about 20 minutes and then we'll have a bit of a discussion and go straight into the questions. I think there are probably too many people here for us to be able to have any kind of open mic. So please do stay muted. Otherwise we'll hear you rather than Dave, which will be a pity. So I'll do my best to try and grab the questions at the end of the day, at the end of the talk, and we'll see if we can have a bit of a discussion. But for now, so on National Book Day, over to Dave. Please tell us all about The Garden Jungle.
Thank you, Tony, and Paul and Joanne for organising this. It always feels slightly bizarre to be sitting in your sitting room, but talking to nearly 200 people scattered all over the world. But anyway, thank you all for joining us. So today I'm going to talk to you about insects, which is sort of my favourite subject. I became hooked on insects, just fascinated by them from a very early age. One of my earliest memories, I think I was about 6. I remember finding these little yellow and black caterpillars on some weeds on the edge of the school playground, primary school, and collecting them up in my lunchbox and taking them home and feeding them, and they eventually turned into these amazing, beautiful red and black moths. You'd probably recognize them as cinnabar moths. And I just thought that was magic, and I've been obsessed by insects ever since, and really feel privileged that somehow I've managed to persuade people to pay me to chase around after insects. How nice is that? Now, hang on, before I ramble on any further, let me share my screen because I've got lots of nice, pretty pictures to show you. Mostly of nice insects. There we go, hang on. Just go full screen. So I think actually lots of people like bugs, creepy crawlies, insects, whatever you want to call them when they're little. They go through a bug phase, if you like. So this is my my youngest son, who's now 10. That was last year with his pet cockchafer, Colin. He's very much in his bug phase at the moment. Absolutely loves insects of all shapes and sizes, and loves nothing more than being able to keep them and watch them and hold them and look after them. And he's just fascinated. And I hope he never grows out of that. But the sad truth is that many people do grow out of their bug phase. And in fact, if they ever have one. And many people, by the time they're teenagers or adults, they're actually frightened of insects. Their first reaction to anything that buzzes near them is to swat at it, to roll a newspaper up and try and kill it, which is really sad because, as I'll explain in a little while, insects are enormously important. So my kind of mission in life, if you like, self-appointed, is to try and persuade people to love insects, or at the very least to respect insects, because they do a whole bunch of stuff that we depend upon, as I'll explain in a bit. But before I do, I hope you don't mind if I think it's kind of useful to set the big picture. And I should warn you, the first half of this talk is somewhat depressing, but it does pick up, and there is light at the end of the tunnel. There is hope. So the second half is more positive. So bear with me, please don't tune out halfway through. So anyway, big picture. So you'll recognize this. This is obviously our planet, an absolutely amazing thing that we often just take for granted and don't really think about. But actually, if you do stop to think, it's ridiculous, really. It's this rock hurtling through space with a thin sort of crust of life clinging to its surface. It's beautiful. It's a source of inspiration and wonder, and of course, food and air and water, and it gives us everything we need. It's our home. It's all we have. And the really odd thing is that, of course, as you all know, we're not looking after it. We're making really a terrible mess of our beautiful planet. We all know about the climate changing, of course, but there are many other issues that are not quite so well known. Soil erosion, for example, depletion of underground aquifers, all sorts of pollution that we're creating in the soil, the air, the seas, and so on. Of course, my focus is on biodiversity loss. I'm an ecologist who, as you've gathered, studies insects. Now, most people, if you start talking about biodiversity, perhaps think about tigers or pandas or big charismatic animals like that, and that are in danger of extinction. But I'm, as you know, much more interested in what's happening with the little creatures, which in many ways are much more important than tigers. Maybe not as spectacular or amazing to look at, but what they actually do ecologically is much more profound. And worryingly, there's a growing body of evidence that our insects are in trouble. And this really came to the sort of public's attention in 2017 when a paper was published from Germany. I was one of the authors, but I have to say I did very little of the work. It was based on some very enthusiastic entomologists putting out malaise traps, which is that funny looking tent-like thing, top right, on nature reserves all across Germany from the late 1980s onwards. These catch flying insects of all sorts. And what the chart shows you is the average daily catch per trap, the weight of insects caught per day. And you can see it fell. It actually fell by 76% in 26 years, from 1989 to 2016. And that really, when this was published, kind of set alarm bells off around the world, because it's got us all speculating, is this happening everywhere, or is this something particular to Germany? And sadly, the evidence suggests that this is happening everywhere. I don't want to show you lots and lots of similar charts of butterflies and bees and so on, because it would all be too depressing. But the evidence is growing and growing that insects, certainly across Europe and North America, where we have good data on their populations, do seem to be in trouble. And as American biologist E.O. or Ed Wilson explained, this could be catastrophic. So this is Ed Wilson is an ant biologist, but a very famous American biologist, very clever chap. He's published hundreds and hundreds of papers on all sorts of things aside from ants, and a big champion of insects. And he said, I won't read it out, but he basically said, if people were to disappear from the planet, it would do very nicely without us and wildlife would thrive. But if insects were to vanish, the environment would collapse into chaos. And I want to quickly explain why he was absolutely right. So firstly, insects make up the bulk of life on Earth. We've so far named 1.1 million different species of insect, which is 2/3 of all the species of animal and plant that we know of on our planet. So insects are biodiversity. And what's more, it's suspected that there may be another 4 million that we haven't even identified yet, which I find mind-blowing. Just think of all these creatures out there that we don't even know exist yet. So they are the bulk of biodiversity, and then they're food for an awful lot of the creatures that aren't insects. So for example, many birds, bats, and lots of small mammals, amphibians like frogs and so on, freshwater fish, they all depend upon insects for food. So if the insects are disappearing, if you're a bee eater living in Germany, well, 3/4 of your food supply disappeared in the last 26 years, and that obviously is going to have impacts. And in fact, insects are involved in almost every process you can think of on land and in fresh water. There are virtually no insects in the sea, interestingly. So, for example, they're vitally important biocontrol agents. They recycle dung and dead trees and dead bodies and leaves and all sorts of other things. They keep the soil healthy. They distribute seeds. They just do almost everything you can think of, which is why Ed Wilson said that the world would grind to a halt, collapse into chaos without them. Of course, the thing that insects do that's probably most widely appreciated by the general public is that they're pollinators. They pollinate wildflowers. 87% of all wildflowers in the world need pollinating by some kind of animal, and it's usually an insect. I should say that it's not necessarily a bee. There are many thousands of species of pollinator. Just in the UK, it was recently estimated that maybe 6,000 different species of insect are involved in pollination, which is quite an astonishing figure. So that includes the bees, of course, but also lots of wasps and butterflies and moths and a huge array of beautiful flies and beetles and so on and so on. And between them, they pollinate our wildflowers and they pollinate our crops. 3/4 of the crops we grow in the world need pollinating by some kind of insect. So we've become used to our supermarkets being full of this amazing array of exotic produce from all around the world, and things wouldn't look so rosy if we didn't have those insect pollinators. We wouldn't have apples or cherries or tomatoes or chili peppers or pumpkins, or even things like coffee and chocolate depend on insect pollinators. So life would be dire indeed without these little creatures. If we're going to prevent further declines of insects and ensure they have a future, we need to understand why they're declining. And I'll say just a little bit about this. It's a big subject, and there are many drivers of insect declines. Habitat loss is almost certainly the biggest. The use of pesticides, but then also things like climate change is starting to kick in. Invasive species are having an impact, and so on and so on. But from a UK perspective, perhaps the biggest blow to insects has been the loss of our flower-rich grasslands in particular, which were a habitat that was extraordinarily rich in wildlife, in biodiversity, particularly in insects. And of course, this kind of habitat used to cover most of the South Downs, and also there were huge extents of lowland hay meadows full of flowers like this. If you could go back to 1930, Britain had about 3 million hectares of this habitat, which in a small island is a lot. But tragically, by 1987, we destroyed 97% of this habitat and replaced it with much more intensively farmed habitats such as that. And it's kind of obvious why, if you're a bumblebee or a butterfly, that wasn't such a good move. Now, one facet of this kind of industrialization of farming has been ever increasing use of pesticides, which also, of course, impacts on insects. And I could say much more about that, but perhaps that's for another day. Other than to add that it isn't just farmers that use pesticides. You can buy them in your local supermarket or garden centre or a DIY store, and I'd encourage you not to, please, but I'll come back to that briefly. I'm guessing, because you're listening to me today, you probably don't buy insecticides and spray them around your garden. You might actually spend your weekends going to garden centres to buy pretty flowers to feed the bees, to make your garden bee friendly. But just beware, because we did a study 3 years ago now, where we went around the local garden centres in Sussex, the big chains, you know, B&Q and Homebase and Yvale and so on. And we bought the bee-friendly flowers and we screened them for pesticides, and found that 75% of them had insecticides in their nectar and pollen. And this was plants being sold as bee-friendly, which is actually rather sad, isn't it, when you think about it? So if you want to get hold of pesticide-free plants for your garden, there are organic nurseries out there available online, or grow them from seed is the simple answer, or do plant swaps with your friends and neighbours. Anyway, so that's it for the doom and gloom. What can we do about it? Well, the good news is there is lots we can all do. Unlike many environmental issues, we do feel completely helpless. You know, I remember last summer watching the footage from Brazil of, you know, the Amazon burning, and you think, what can I do? You know, it's terrible, but I feel completely helpless about that. But insects, they live all around us. They live in our gardens, sometimes in extraordinary numbers. And so we can all get involved in looking after them. Most of them aren't yet extinct. And unlike tigers or rhinos, they can breed really quickly. And we just need to provide them with the right habitat and they'll come back. So I think, you know, this is a positive story that everyone can engage with and feel kind of empowered to do something, particularly if you've got some kind of garden. Now, the UK has about 20 million gardens covering a bigger area than all of our nature reserves put together, which if you then add in all the city parks and roundabouts and road verges and cemeteries and other green spaces, amounts to a kind of national network of potential bee habitat, not just bees, insect habitat, not just insects, wildlife habitat. And this, I think, is a kind of open door, because it's already, people have already bought into this. Lots of people are already looking to attract wildlife into their garden to make them pollinator friendly. They want more bumblebees and butterflies. And so I think with a little bit of a push, this you know, could be really big and could significantly help our wildlife. You can tell I'm quite excited about this, and this of course is why I wrote the book, but Tony mentioned The Garden Jungle. I do have a new one coming out on the 1st of April, April Fool's Day, appropriately enough, called Gardening for Bumblebees, which is a kind of nuts and bolts guide to, as it says in the subtitle, a practical guide to creating a paradise for pollinators. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about what's in both of these books in the next, I haven't got many, 5 or 6 minutes. So how to make your garden wildlife friendly? Well, this is how not to make your garden wildlife friendly. This is my idea of hell, if I'm honest. This is actually an AstroTurf garden with hard paving. And, you know, I even saw the other day somewhere selling plastic wisteria that you can pin to your house. Flowers for 12 months of the year. What's not to like? This is just horrendous, if you ask me. So I would love it if we could make it socially unacceptable to have this kind of garden, and instead have 20 million gardens that look more like that. Or this is a little bit of my garden, actually, one of the prettier bits. But a wildlife garden doesn't have to be ugly. It can be beautiful. It can be full of flowers, and the types of flowers are important, of course, and I'll come back to that briefly in a second. Other things to do, of course, this goes without saying, ditch the pesticides. There's just no need in your garden. There's a debate to be had about whether pesticides are vital to food production and to feeding everybody, but there is no debate, as far as I'm concerned, about the need for pesticides in your garden. It's just madness that we allow people with no training at all to wander into their local garden centre and buy poisons and spray them around their garden, probably without even bothering to read the back of the tin. So get rid of those. Honestly, the insecticides, you just don't need them. If you find you've got an aphid outbreak on your roses or on your runner beans or whatever, if you just leave them well alone, almost invariably within a week or two, this whole army of little helpers will come dashing over the horizon to eat them for you. You know, all sorts of lovely, wonderful creatures. And worst case scenario, even if these creatures don't come to your help, well, you'll have slightly fewer runner beans or slightly fewer roses. Surely that's better than spraying your garden with poison. So ditch the poisons. Think about how you manage your lawn. This is one of the easiest things we could all do, because it actually saves you time and petrol in the mower to mow less often. And most people's lawns are actually full of flowers that would love the chance to flower if you just stop mowing quite so much. We Brits are slightly obsessed with trying to recreate a kind of Wimbledon tennis court in our back garden, ideally with stripes up and down. My dad, bless him, he's 88 and he still aspires to having a stripy lawn. But this is my lawn, and we've never sown any wildflowers in it. It's just what happens if you don't cut too much. It just bursts into flower. So next time you get the urge to mow, if instead you can just kind of calm yourself down a bit and try and relax, make yourself a cup of coffee, gin and tonic, sit down and admire the flowers and watch the bees come and visit, rather than getting the mower out, then that is the simplest thing in the world. And it would really make a difference if enough people did that. When it comes to choosing pretty flowers to grow in your garden, there's so much information out there that it's hard to kind of capture it in a minute or two here. But a few simple rules are maybe helpful. One of which is avoid double flowers. So an awful lot of the ornamental flowers on sale in garden centres are double varieties, which are actually mutants, where the anthers, which normally produce pollen, have mutated into extra petals. So instead of a lovely flower like that rose bottom left with all those lovely orange anthers giving pollen to the bees, you've got instead that classic kind of, they're called hybrid tea roses, top left, which is just a bundle of petals and is completely useless to a bee. And similarly, the others are all examples of double varieties, and there are many, many others in your garden centre. So stick to single varieties. Generally, old-fashioned cottage garden plants are best. My books will give you more information, or I've got lots of videos that you can look at about which are the best plants to grow in your garden for bees and butterflies and so on. You might also like to include native wildflowers in your garden. Now, many people think of native plants as weeds when they're in a garden setting. And of course, a weed is an artificial concept. It's a word we've invented to apply to plants that we've decided are in the wrong place. And so it's kind of arbitrary. And actually, you can get rid of all the weeds in your garden just like that, by just calling them wildflowers instead. And so these are all examples of very common plants that grow all over Sussex, which pollinators absolutely love, but which are normally persecuted in a garden setting. People spray them with herbicide, they spend hours digging them out. But actually, if you can bring yourself to just let them flower, deadhead them if you don't want them to spread, then the pollinators will really thank you for it. A few final things you might do in your garden. You might make a bee hotel. Lots of information out there. These are to provide nesting sites for solitary bees, some of which love to nest in horizontal holes. And these work really well, in my experience anyway. You can make them yourself. A great project, fun thing to do at the weekend with your kids or whatever. I've made a YouTube video about that as well. Or you can buy them, and you can buy some lovely ones with little windows on the side so you can peek in and look at the developing bees inside, which is great fun for kids. You might also make something which is less well known, which is a hoverfly lagoon. This is something that's been pioneered by one of my former PhD students, Ellie Rotheray, who's at Sussex University these days. She's a hoverfly nut. And she realized that there are lots of hoverflies that like to breed in tiny puddles. The flies themselves are rather beautiful and they're important pollinators. There's a couple on the right there. But their larvae are, to many people's eyes, somewhat less attractive. Their common English name is a rat-tailed maggot. There's one in the top center. I think they're actually rather magnificent creatures. That tail is actually a snorkel. It's a breathing tube. And these insects, the larvae, live in on bacteria in created by rotting vegetation in small puddles. And it's really easy to create one of these with any kind of waterproof container, fill it with water and chuck in a handful of leaves or grass. And as soon as they start to decay, you'll see these beautiful flies arrive and start laying eggs. Again, YouTube video if you want more details. And one finishing touch, why not try an earwig hotel? This is something we've been dabbling with. I've had undergrad students testing these out, and they seem to work really well. And earwigs are really good biocontrol agents of pests in orchards. So encourage a little army of earwigs to live in your apple trees if you're lucky enough to have them. And they'll return the favor by eating all the pests for you. If you want to know more, apart from the books, there's a good report that I helped to write for the Wildlife Trust called Reversing the Decline of Insects that you can download for free online. And it's full of ideas and inspiring examples of some really cool things that are already happening for insects, not just gardens, but in other contexts as well. So to wrap up, this may be a little bit cheesy, but there is no planet B, as many people have said before. We need to look after this one because we're not going to live on Mars anytime soon. And I find it really strange that people would do anything for their kids apart from apparently leaving them a decent planet to live on. And we have to do a bit better than that. And maybe we can start by looking after the insects living in our gardens. Thank you all very much for listening.
Excellent. Thanks very much indeed. Stop share. We'll see if I have a bit of a discussion. I found that was fantastic, really fascinating. I've also had a sneak preview of the book, so it's quite interesting to see some of that come to life. And for me, what you were saying about hay meadows and lawns really rings true, because the loss of all those hay meadows, 97% since the kind of 1930s, and I think quite a lot since the 1980s has gone as well. So we're really losing a hell of a lot. One thing I heard at one time was that actually the importance of those meadows was not just the volume of nectar, but actually it filled a kind of nectar gap by being late flowering in the year sometimes, which wasn't much, there didn't seem to be much else around. So that I found, I don't know whether you've got a view on that, but and also
no, I haven't actually. That's an interesting idea. I'd never really thought about that. I mean, they are. Those flowery meadows, they tend to have very few flowers in the spring. They don't kick in until May, June, but then they go right through to late summer. So I guess that makes perfect sense.
Yeah, that's what I heard, was that there was a period in the year where there's actually not a lot of nectar elsewhere, but actually the hay meadows filled that gap. So that's why it had a disproportionate effect, even though there were vast amounts of flowers anyway. And I certainly back up what you say about the lawn. We proudly left ours unmown for a while, and it started to look like yours. And then we actually got some common spotted orchids, which are great. But I was particularly annoyed to find that Paul has got some bee orchids in his lawn. So I was very jealous.
Oh wow! Yeah, I'm very envious. I haven't got any. I've got 2 acres, most of which is long kind of grass and meadow, an orchard and so on. Not one orchid yet, but. I live in hope that some might drift in. The seeds are so tiny, they're just like dust, so they can travel long distances. So if I'm lucky, they might turn up.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, so there's a lot of questions coming into the. I think actually people waited until you're finished because they were looking at concentrating on you rather than writing questions. But I think some of them have answered themselves. There's the inevitable questions on neonicotinoids, which have come out. Do you want to say anything quick on the neonicotinoid story?
Well, there is some very recent good news on that one. It's a long story, and I'll assume I won't try and explain it all because we'd be here for the next 20 minutes. But basically, the government granted a derogation to sugar beet farmers to use these insecticides, which are basically banned in Europe. But the governments are allowed to grant exemptions to farmers to use them if they can argue it's an emergency. So we were all set to see them being used again in the UK on sugar beet. But thankfully, there's a pest forecasting system run by Rothamsted Research Station in Hertfordshire, which tries to predict how bad the pests will be on sugar beet. And it's because of that cold snap we had where it was really cold a week or so ago, it's killed all the pests, so that actually the farmers don't need the neonicotinoid and the exemption has essentially been withdrawn. We can breathe a sigh of relief for one more year, but I'm sure they'll be back.
Yeah, it's an interesting debate because I saw your discussion on the Wildlife Trust Wildlife, and I thought the sugar beet farmer was actually quite persuasive, very good. But actually, there was a bigger picture thing there, which yeah, I agree. But we're saved by the weather this year. My biggest worry is that having the pesticides there kind of stops people doing the other research, which may point in other directions. But that's another thing.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a big issue, a much bigger issue than whether we can make our gardens more wildlife friendly. Is how do we make the countryside more wildlife friendly? And 70% of Britain is farmland, and an awful lot of that, sadly, is pretty hostile to insect life, to wildlife. Pesticide use has risen steadily. And the most recent figures from DEFRA suggest that the average arable crop is treated 17 times with pesticides each year now, which is 70% higher than it was in 1990s. So this is a problem that's not going away, it's getting worse.
Amazing.
So, yeah, I think we need to rethink farming sort of from the bottom up. But that's kind of a big subject. And,
a big subject. Maybe we won't crack that in the next 10, 20 minutes, but we'll have a go.
Maybe not.
A good question right at the beginning, actually, which I think you've probably alluded to a little bit, especially looking at that AstroTurf garden. Incredible. I've seen several like that. And again, my idea of hell as well. But a question from Laura was, what's the best way to actually kind of talk around the skeptics, the people who see wildflower areas and see mess rather than anything that they actually want to support?
Well, so for unmown grass in parks and road verges and so on, I mean, it is interesting that, some people complain. They write to the council and say, why haven't you cut the park? Why haven't you cut the verges? It looks a mess. But I think a large part of that is education, that if they realized it was deliberate, they might have a different view. And obviously, if you bump into one of these people that complains, you tell them some of the things I've talked about tonight, that we're actually in a crisis here. We can't just carry on mowing the hell out of everything because we think it looks nice that way. But actually, with a little bit of thought, you can make the long grass and meadow areas much more acceptable. So really simple things like putting a sign up, along a road verge or in a park in front of the meadow area saying wildflower area. So people don't think it's laziness. And then it's a really silly little trick, but it seems to work. If you mow a path through the middle so that it looks managed, suddenly people think, oh, that's lovely, and they rather than writing a letter, they'll go and admire the flowers and the bees. So it's about kind of education and managing people's expectations and perceptions. We're getting there. And certainly in last April and May, when verges weren't being mowed because of lockdown, lots of people on social media were talking about how amazing the verges looked because they were suddenly seeing flowers they'd never seen, which had obviously been there the whole time. They just never got a chance to bloom. Yeah. And so I think that really helped to change people's perception of that whole issue. And actually, Plant Life, also the charity, have got a big campaign on road verge management, which seems to be helping. So there's a kind of momentum behind change there, I think, which is great.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've given advice to churchyards, for example. They particularly like the kind of mown track through the untamed wilderness because then it looks like it's meant to be. So that's a good one. I think a question from Suzanne about she's got lots of dandelions, which she really likes, which is great, very good news. But she's worried that they may actually, she doesn't want to dig them all up anyway, but she's worried that they may actually swamp other plants. Now, I mean, expanding this into I suppose a general question, the problem about certain plants tending to take hold and swamp, becoming more competitive and swamping out others. Have you got any kind of little tricks about how you can stop the most competitive plants from taking over?
Yeah, I mean, it isn't easy. I try to kind of gently steer rather than kind of obliterate and batter with chemicals or whatever. I mentioned it when I was talking about, dandelions. Deadheading is one solution that for some plants is relatively easy. So you wait until it's finished flowering and then just snip the heads off. Obviously, that's not practical if you've got rolling acres, but if you've got a small garden, then it's perfectly easy. It's a shame in a way, though, because those seeds are fantastic food for goldfinches and other birds. So if you can leave them, then, please do. But otherwise, I find that they're no more. Some of these plants have been rather demonized. I mean, so ragwort, for example, I let flower in my garden freely. I don't bother deadheading it, and it doesn't spread. Actually, ragwort is a plant that only really can successfully sprout in bare patches of soil. It's associated with overgrazed pasture that's been badly managed, and that's when it becomes a problem. In a garden, it's no more invasive than delphinium. So, you know, there's nothing to be terrified of. These things aren't kind of monsters that are going to run amok in your garden.
Yes, I think ragwort's only as poisonous as daffodils. Yeah, we're quite happy with daffodils.
Yeah, well, I don't know. I don't want to upset any horse lovers here, because I know some people do get a bit hot under the collar about ragwort, but it's a native British plant. It supports a whole load of wonderful wildlife, including the cinnabar moths I mentioned right at the beginning, which of course help to keep the ragwort in control as well. And it has been sort of demonized because very occasionally animals die when they consume it, but that only happens if you make hay from the ragwort. Animals know full well not to eat live ragwort. They don't like the taste and they don't touch it. So it's no danger at all when it's growing in a garden or a field. It's only if you turn it into hay, dry it out, and then feed it to horses that then you might be in trouble. But that's fairly easily avoided.
Yeah, it's true, and it doesn't even spread as far as people think. But moving on. There's an interesting question here from Christine, which I actually you may give a more sophisticated answer than she's imagining. She's got ground bees living in her lawn, so presumably on bare patches. So I guess these are the group of bees that actually make holes in bare sandy areas or bare ground areas. So that actually makes for a different sort of set of habitats, doesn't it? The kind of open, bare ground sort of habitats for certain sorts of bees and wasps. I mean, do you want to say anything about how you might support, solitary bees and wasps as well as the kind of nectar sources?
Yeah. So obviously the bee hotels cater for some solitary bees and wasps, but they're very specific, quite a small number of species that like horizontal holes and probably naturally would nest in maybe beetle holes in a dead tree trunk or something like that. But actually the majority of British bee species are ground nesting. They burrow into the ground. And we tend to notice the species that like to nest in open areas, bare ground, because you can see the little nests often with a little kind of conical pile of soil that they've excavated next to the hole. But there are actually some species that will very happily nest in lawn, for example. They don't need bald patches. So there's a thing called the tawny mining bee, which is one of the more beautiful solitary bees, which will happily nest in a normal lawn. It doesn't need bare ground at all. So it's not particularly easy to create habitats successfully, especially for these bees to nest in. I did recently had a PhD student who tried doing this on farmland. She got the farmers to scrape bare a little patch of field margin with machinery, just a few square meters. And she found that it worked a little bit. She had some of these ground nesting solitary bees moved in, but it didn't strike me as it was something that would work particularly well in a garden. You don't really want a great patch of bare ground in the hope that you might get 2 or 3 solitary bees nesting in it. So that aspect of bee biology is quite hard to cater for, it seems.
Yeah. Interesting. I mean, so many of these things kind of speak about diversity as much as anything. If you try to create a lot of one thing, So
it's interesting actually. If you wander around the Knepp estate, which I'm sure many people have, in the summer, you see solitary bees nesting along the tracks left by the vehicles. And you think, well, what did these bees do before there were vehicles? Who knows? Maybe they used to nest in the paths left by large wild animals when we had, aurochs wandering through the forests or whatever. I don't think we'll ever probably know the answer to that.
No, interesting, isn't it? Yeah, good. That was an interesting question here from Cheryl. I think she's actually in favour of wasps, but she basically asked, is there any way of dissuading wasps from nesting in places where you rather they wouldn't nest? She's not an anti-wasp person. She recognises they're important predators. I haven't seen the inevitable question about why are wasps, which you sometimes get. But so I think everyone recognises they're valuable predators. But what do you do to dissuade them from nesting where you really don't want them nesting?
I must admit, I don't have an answer for that. Other than actually, you know, so we had a nest in our garden shed last year, just hanging from the apex of the shed, and it grew to, I guess, the size of a football by the middle of summer. And you could go in and out of the shed. We could get our bikes in and out. They just didn't bother us at all. So I must admit, when it first appeared, I was slightly nervous about going in the shed because it was literally a meter above your head, this giant nest full of wasps, but it was no trouble. So I can't really think of many situations where you really need to be concerned. I mean, I guess preventing the queens from getting in the first place may be a solution. And if you do, I mean, the queens start wasp nests single-handedly. There's just a little tiny paper cup that they make first. And if you see that, then I guess you could destroy it and hopefully the queen would move on to somewhere else. But I don't have any clever tricks. If anyone else does, you know, please put it in the chat.
Yeah, interesting. I read somewhere about things called waspinators, which are things that look like, they're supposed to look like wasp nests. I hear that the wasps are territorial, so they see the nest and fly away. Is that a myth?
I think it's absolute rubbish because I've come across wasp nests really close to each other before. So I'm not convinced that they avoid each other at all. But, you know, you're welcome to give it a go. Maybe it'll work.
Yeah, I confidently told a neighbour this as well, saying that you never get two wasp nests together. And he dragged me to his shed and said, well, look at those three then. Never mind. Great. Oh, well, there's so many questions here. I'm picking up. I'm not very good at speed reading, everyone. So many apologies if I miss yours. There's the inevitable question about what are slugs good for? Do you want to handle slugs? I know they're not bees. But
well, of course, they're food for lots of interesting creatures. Hedgehogs, slow worms, all sorts of creatures like to eat slugs. They're important decomposers. They help to break down organic matter. Some slugs are predators of slugs. If you want to get rid of slugs, actually some types of slug are quite valuable for that. But actually, I get a bit, I don't know. I think it's a bit of a shame that we have to justify creatures' existence in terms of what they do for us. Don't slugs have as much right to be here as we do, in my view? So actually, I think we should stop trying to find reasons why something exists and just accept them and live with them.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, and I heard somebody, an organic gardener, saying, yes, the big slugs eat the little slugs. You get rid of the big ones, you're probably doing more harm than good, which is interesting. But slugs aren't bees, and that's kind of slightly off talk here. Let's try to look down through some of the other arguments, some of the other discussions here. Somebody said, feed the soil, not the plant. We had a very interesting discussion a month ago from Charles Dowding, who's a no-dig expert. And his whole thing is about, well, not digging, obviously, but feeding the soil rather than plants. I mean, have you got any kind of thoughts about the way people look at regenerating soils as the way to look at the way you look at your garden, rather than concentrating too much on the speed of growth of the plants, for example?
Those of you that heard Charles talking will already know far more about how to manage your soil to keep it healthy and to capture carbon than I can say, because he is kind of the man when it comes to garden soil. But I mean, really simple stuff, which for those of you that didn't hear him, he basically tries to avoid any digging, because digging damages the structure of the soil, increases oxidization of soil carbon into the atmosphere, encourages soil erosion and so on, and it kills worms and the like. So instead of digging out weeds, he mulches everything with huge amounts of as much organic matter as he can, which then encourages things like worms, which drag it down into the soil, and that increases the soil carbon and makes the soil more fertile, and so on. And but soil health is absolutely vital, and it's something that I think generally people have been really ignorant of until quite recently, particularly in farming. We've been basically hammering our soils, plowing them, applying lots of fertilizers to them, contaminating them with pesticides. And so worm populations in farmland are way down on what they used to be, so far as we can tell. So looking after soil is really key. And there's already evidence that garden soils tend to be a lot healthier than farm soils already. But there's probably more we can all do to capture carbon in our gardens. So soil is the biggest store of carbon, more so than forests. Soils capture much more carbon. And we can all get involved in doing that. And the key is just basically recycling organic matter back into the ground as much as you can. So you've got to have a compost heap. Anyone who's got a garden, please start composting all your green waste. Throwing it in the green bin to be taken away by the council is madness. You need that lovely organic matter to fertilize your soil.
Oh, absolutely. I've got lots of compost heaps. It's interesting what you're saying about carbon in soils as well, because looking at the evidence from the Nep estate, in just 15 years, the organic carbon in the soils there has built up, has doubled. So that's very interesting. There's a question here which sounds specific, but we could probably open it up to make it more general. The question is from Liz. What are your views on aeroponics and vertical farming? And I suppose this perhaps links in with things being done in urban and peri-urban environments, how you squeeze a lot into a small space, maybe green roofs, green vertical, green walls. What are your views on those sorts of structures?
I must say I'm no expert on those kind of things at all, but I do love the idea of more greenery in urban areas to help combat heating effect. The more greenery you have, the cooler it is. It helps to capture atmospheric particulate pollution as well. And I've seen some wonderful examples of city buildings with plants all up the side of them and on the top of them, and it looks like a sort of giant forest or something. It's amazing. So it can be done, and also growing our own food in cities, in city farms, community farms, those kind of things. I think that's really nice because it reconnects people with where food comes from, and it's something that I'd love to see local councils encouraging more of. Unfortunately, a big proportion of the population, I think, have kind of forgotten that food actually has to grow and it needs clean, good soils and water and sunlight and clean air and everything. And they just think food materializes in the supermarket miraculously, which of course it doesn't. So, getting people and nature together by inviting nature in, growing food and so on in our cities seems like a really good idea to me.
Yeah, it seems to have been quite a resurgence in homegrown food during the lockdown. I know that because trying to buy seeds is turning into quite a problem because there's so much demand.
Yeah, I mean, there are many good things come out of the lockdown. I've already talked about road verges, but I think that, and also actually I think people just spent more time in their gardens, maybe growing vegetables, but looking at nature, and reconnecting a little bit. So be nice if that continues.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just watching some of the chat here, and it looks like some people are answering some other people's questions, which is great. There's a bit of a community going on here, which is fantastic. There's a question here which we're often asked, and I know you're going to enjoy answering this one. What would you advise about brambles and nettles taking over?
Well, so I mean, of course, brambles are one of the best nectar sources for a huge range of pollinators, and the fruit is absolutely delicious, or you could leave it for the birds. So it's actually a really valuable wildlife plant, as are nettles, of course, famously food for caterpillars of lots of butterflies and quite a few moths as well, and good to eat. Nettles, if you pick them at this time of year, before they're too tall and tough, they're as useful as spinach. You can make them into all sorts of things. And actually, as long as you keep them in a corner of the garden, you don't let them go, just completely let them run free, they're not difficult to contain at all. I mean, nettles, ideally, if you've got some kind of, you can grow them in a tub or contain them in some way, because they do spread by rhizomes running just under the soil surface. If you can stop those from spreading, then they really don't, they're easy to keep contained. So a wildlife garden should not be full of nettles and brambles, but if you can squeeze in and leave some in the corner somewhere, then fantastic.
Yeah, we certainly allow certain amounts of brambles and nettles around here. In fact, we'd have trouble not allowing them. But it's great, all those broken bits of bramble sticks with things nesting in them. Yeah, fantastic. And I heard the other day, you don't burn your waste too early in the year because you'll be killing off everything that was overwintering in those brambles or dead nettles.
Yes, and similarly deadheading as well. If you can bear to leave all the last year's herbaceous flower stalks right through until the plants start to sprout up again this spring, that's great. It leaves seeds for the birds, but also there's hundreds and hundreds of little spiders and insects hiding in there waiting for spring. And as you say, if you if you tidy them all away and set light to them, then that's fairly disastrous, really.
Oh yeah, horrible.
If you can leave brash piles forever and just let them slowly moulder down, actually, rather than having a bonfire, is also good. Not everyone has space, but I used to have bonfires in the garden with woody material, but these days I just leave it, stack it up, and let it slowly break down, provide a home for lots of insects, and then add all that carbon to the soil.
Yeah, so I'm amazed sometimes how you build a compost heap that's so big it seems to block the sun out, and a month or two later it's gone right down to almost nothing. Incredible. I'm just watching it. There's a lot of people who seem to be supporting slugs, which is nice. The slugs just need to borrow the ladybird's PR agent. That's a nice one. Slugs love beer. I don't know whether that's to put them off or to actually give them a drink. Oh, have you got a recommendation for a good insect book for children?
Oh.
I can't think of one, but there again, I haven't got any children.
Can't immediately. No, I can't. And there must be somebody. We've got 177 people. Somebody got ideas? Please put it in the chat if you have.
I know Izzy Tree at the NEPA State has just written a book for children about rewilding. It's called, I think, When We Went Wild or something. That's literally just come out. So that would be quite good.
I've got an old book I had when I was a kid called the Oxford Book of Insects, which is a fairly sort of simple guide to the more obvious and big insects you might find. I enjoyed that when I was little, but I don't even know if it's still in print. Probably not, I guess.
I just noticed that Cheryl's actually put a link to a good children's book in the chat, which is great. What else we got here? All sorts of things going on. I'm seeing the time. I might have to hand back to Paul in a minute, because there's just very strong apologies for anybody I've left out here, because it's actually quite difficult to have a decent chat while looking at what's coming in question-wise. Fantastic. So thanks very much indeed, Dave. That was really interesting. Can I now hand back to Paul to tell us a little bit about the future? Thanks very much.
Brilliant. Thank you ever so much, Dave, and thank you, Tony. That was I made lots of notes. I think we all did, and just from looking at the chat, I think everybody was really engaged and inspired by your talk, and I agree with 100% what you say. I have no gardening knowledge or expertise whatsoever, but I'm rewilding our garden, and I'm going to be doing everything you talked about and a lot more. And I think there's a lot of people looking at doing it this year. So thank you ever so much. And as we come to an end, I'm just going to put in the chat details for our next event, which is behind me, which is a very different aspect of the environment. And one of the things about Green Books is we're covering a wide range. We've done gardening, we've looked at wildlife. We're now going to be looking at green investing, which is incredibly important, because if we can't change finance and business, we're really going to struggle to tackle climate breakdown. And so that's coming up on April the 1st. We've also got a number of other events. Just to remind you, you can get Dave's book at the Stunning Bookshop, 15% off if you say Green Books. And on that note, I'd like to thank Joanne for organising this, Vivian for helping to co-host it, and above all, Tony and our featured speaker, Dave. I think it's been a great evening, so well done, and thank you ever so much.
I've just seen a recommendation in the chat line for The Hungry Caterpillar, a children's book.
Indeed.
I remember George W. Bush saying that was his favourite book as a child, but sadly it wasn't written until he was about 35.
Probably not the best endorsement.
Did he read it or just colour it in?
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. That's the end of the webinar.
Cheers, everyone.